Good Sunday morning. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there, Sue O'Connell included, I should say.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of At Issue. I'm Matt Pritchard in for Corey Smith.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. Coming up, John Deaton, the attorney who recently moved to Massachusetts and is running for the U.S. Senate. He joins us to talk about why he's running to unseat Senator Elizabeth Warren this fall. And the acting chair of the Cannabis Commission, Eva Concepcion, will join us.
Now, we're coming off a busy week in politics. President Biden last week again spoke out against rising anti-Semitism. That behavior has been seen at some pro-Palestinian protests across the country. The president tried to assure Jewish Americans they shouldn't feel alone. Mr. Biden gave that speech on Tuesday afternoon, and it led to a bizarre split-screen moment that people in our newsroom are really noticing that captures the odd nature of this year's presidential cycle. While the president was speaking out at a Holocaust remembrance on some networks, other networks are breaking down ongoing developments in former President Donald Trump's hush money trial and the testimony from porn actress Stormy Daniels as she testified that she had had sex with Donald Trump 18 years ago.
Of course, much of the focus this November will be on the presidential race. In Massachusetts, there will also be several ballot questions and a U.S. Senate contest.
And one candidate running to take on Democratic incumbent Senator Elizabeth Warren is joining us now. That's John Deaton, a retired Marine officer, a cancer survivor, and an attorney who has represented cancer and asbestos victims. John, thanks so much for coming in studio. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course. So let's talk a little bit about why you're running in the first place. You're taking on one of the most well-known senators in the country, and obviously you just moved here from Rhode Island. What brings you to Massachusetts, and why do you want to run for Senate?
Well, first, I have deep connections to Massachusetts. In fact, not only did I graduate law school at New England School of Law in Boston, lived in Roxbury, East Boston, and Malden, I was chosen by the Marine Corps to represent the Commonwealth for the 1994 Judge Advocate Law contract. I couldn't get into Harvard or pay for Harvard, but I beat Harvard students, BC, BU, and Suffolk Law. So I'm very proud of that. And since then, for 22 years, I've represented, as you said, asbestos victims fighting major corporations and insurance companies across the Commonwealth. Dozens and dozens of working families. We're talking plumbers, iron workers, shipyard workers, IBEW electricians, carpenters, auto mechanics. So for 22 years, I've been sitting literally at the kitchen table of working families across the Commonwealth discussing the issues of importance. So I believe my Massachusetts credentials stack up against anyone.
In terms of just why you're running then, what brought you to want to get into politics? What do you think you can change?
You know, that's a great question. And the answer is I felt compelled to do it because I am the American dream, and if you read my book, you're going to have to agree. I am the living embodiment of the American dream, and I'm sitting back and I'm watching that dream die before my eyes, and I wonder, can a kid in Springfield or Brockton or Roxbury, would they have the same opportunities that I had? And when you look at all the problems we face, illegal immigration out of control, debt crisis, 40% of Americans don't have $500 in case of an emergency, the government's debt, $1 trillion personal credit card debt, opioid addictions, foreign wars, all these things are happening, but the greatest crisis we face in this country is a crisis of leadership because career politicians like Senator Warren are sitting in Washington, D.C., and they're fueling division, pitting American versus American, and I want to do something about it. I want to show the voters a nonpartisan choice who's been a Republican, a Democrat, and an unenrolled voter in his life, and is going to just go do the job. Elizabeth Warren wants to desperately keep the job. I want to go do it.
She's only had 2 terms, though, at this point. You said she's a career, lifelong politician. So what has she missed, I guess, in those first 2 terms that you think she should have been doing over the course of that time?
Well, first of all, I support term limits because I believe if you can't effectuate change in more than a decade in Washington, D.C., then you lack the skill set to do it. Move over and give someone else an opportunity to do it. But here's an example. Senator Warren is the best or worst example, how you phrase it, of what happens in Washington, D.C. 12 years ago, she pounded the table that she was outraged that no banker went to prison from the 2008 financial crisis, and she was going to Washington, D.C. to hold the bankers accountable. Who do you think wrote her last bill? the banking industry led by Jamie Dimon. That's what happens. She didn't have the skill set to beat him, so she joined him. I'm going to go to D.C. and offer a different option.
Someone might argue that if you are going to have a bill written that's going to impact a lot of different industries, you might want to have people from that industry involved in writing the bill. In Massachusetts and Boston, around housing, the BRA, the Boston Development, they have real estate agents and developers involved. Would you say that no one that has expertise should be involved in writing a bill?
Not at all. There's a difference between seeking input and saying, write the bill that favors your industry. And that's exactly what's happened recently. And so, of course, you seek the advice and input of experts in the field, but you don't let an industry write the bill and then hand it to you and you stamp your approval. Make no mistake about it. Senator Elizabeth Warren is right now the biggest lobbyist for the banking industry in the country.
So we're here in Massachusetts, where the largest group of voters are the unaffiliated, unenrolled voters that are not necessarily total Republicans or total Democrats. We've had a number of Republican governors over the years with a controlled state house of Democrats. So the question I imagine a number of voters will have for you is, A, what kind of Republican are you? And who are your Republican role models?
Oh, it's a great question. First, let me just say, I don't think there's anyone quite like me that has the life experience that I've had in the Senate, who's overcome poverty and who literally represents regular people and identifies with regular working people and poor people. I'm a small government, fiscally conservative, socially moderate Republican. If you force me to choose a Republican that is sort of like me, it would be Governor Baker, Lieutenant Governor Polito, of that centrist, fiscally conservative Republican who is more of a common sense approach and a nonpartisan approach. And that's what I bring. The difference between me and Elizabeth Warren, and there are quite a few differences, is that I'm not going to be loyal to a party or a person. I'm going to be loyal to one thing. I have one test. Is it good for Massachusetts and America? If it is, call it a Democrat proposal, I'm all in. Call it a Republican proposal, I'm all in. That's the test, not a political agenda or not a person or party.
Circling back to what you were saying about Senator Elizabeth Warren and some of the bills that she's written, are you saying that she's a tool of the banking industry? I mean, do you think that's a fair criticism based on her record?
I think it is today. I think 12 years ago, let me give Senator Warren the benefit of the doubt. I believe Senator Warren, when she first was running, she meant the things that she was saying, that she was going to go to Washington, she was going to hold those bankers accountable and all of those things. That's why I favor term limits. At some point, you become part of the problem. And when you, a decade later, the people you were going to hold accountable write the bill and you just sign it, that is a problem. And that's something that needs to change. And that's why we need term limits. And term limits are amazing because they don't discriminate. Republican, Democrat, Independent, doesn't matter. You get your 12 years if you're a senator to effectuate change. And if you don't have the skill set, let someone like me who does have the skill set do it.
Let's go to another topic here as well. We wanted to talk about the southern border, of course, immigration, a huge topic. I believe you went to the border recently and got to see a little bit of what's going on down there. I wonder just what your impressions were of what you saw in the specific spot you went to.
Well, I was familiar with the spot that I went to because prior to going to the border, I was in the Marine Corps, and I served in Yuma, Arizona at Marine Corps Air Station. I was the chief prosecutor for the base, and it actually had coordinated with Border Patrol, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, you know, drug infiltration into America, and I was involved in some of those sort of undercover sting operations. But what amazed me is that 25 years later, it is far worse than it was when I was involved in fighting the drug distribution. And I would encourage anyone that's running for office or someone more important like Senator Warren who's in office to do what I did. Go to the border because you will truly appreciate it. If you experience what I experienced, you would come back and you would have an appreciation for two things. That we have a national security crisis and we have a humanitarian crisis because you can't leave that border without having amazingly deep sympathy for these migrants and what they're going through and this false promise that they've been promised where they pay the cartel everything they own. And there's drug trafficking, there's sex trafficking, there's child trafficking. And partisan politics is getting in the way of that. And I think that if you go see the root of the cause, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you'll come back. I think Senator Warren, if she'd have went to the border like I did before that bill, she wouldn't have voted no for the immigration reform bill. She'd have voted yes, because at least it would have been better than the status quo.
Well, let's talk about the status quo, because I think most people would agree that Congress over the decades has contributed, if not been the major architect of the problems at the border, the problems with immigration, the problem with our migrants. You know, the Republicans had something in front of them that they helped write that would have at least been a step, I think most would agree, in the right direction to addressing issues at the border. It was killed, some think orchestrated. I think even Donald Trump has said by him. What would you have done if you were in Senate? Would you have been a leader to the Republicans and said, we need to pass this bill? This is a step forward. Joe Biden says he's going to sign it.
Absolutely. I would have supported that bill. It's not a perfect bill, and I'd like to see more done, but it stops the bleeding of the inflow. And so I believe Senator Warren was wrong for voting against that bill. I would have voted for it. But what I would encourage them to do is come back with me. Let's go to the border. Let you experience what I experienced, because if you are a decent human being, you're going to come back and you're going to roll up your sleeves and you're going to get the job done. And that's...
I'm laughing only because and not at you, I'm laughing that a number of lawmakers go to the border and stand there and give a speech and then come back to their states, in which you haven't done, and I appreciate that, criminalize the migrants who have come here by calling them illegal immigrants when they're actually here legally and they're not immigrants, they're migrants. How would you work within the Republican Party to have them think more like you?
Well, the first thing, shame on anyone that did what you said, whether they're Republican or a Democrat. This is a humanitarian crisis. And let me tell you, I already had sympathy for the migrants. I can identify being poor, wanting a better life. I listened to my mother cry at night on the nights that we couldn't eat. That stays with you no matter how much money you have in the bank account or no matter which title you have. And then when you go and you experience the trauma they're putting through, women being raped, children being raped, owning this servile indebtedness to the cartel for life. You know, they need to come off, get a job so they can make payments to the cartel. And that's what I mean. I don't see how any person, and I blame Republicans, I blame Democrats, how any person could go experience that and not come back and say, we have to secure the border for national security reasons. And this system that we have in place is actually cruel to these people. And that's what I would lead with.
I want to bring it back to your upbringing. You sort of spoke about it there just a moment ago, and we have your book right here, which is Food Stamp Warrior. This is a really interesting look back on your life, of everything that you've gone through, whether it's violence that you experienced in a bad Detroit neighborhood, sexual violence, all these things that you bring up in the book. But I wanted to bring up one specific passage in this. Let's see if I can get it open here. You're talking about basically one of your best friends being killed in a drive-by shooting. And at one point you say that I kept squeezing the trigger after this had happened as bullets shot through the car, blasted the black window into shards. I saw a person in the back slump down, and I'm still not sure if it's because I hit him or if he ducked. This is a really frank sort of admission here of that you don't know what took place in that moment. Do you have any regrets writing that, I guess, now that you're running for office? No,
I would never regret the book, and I could tell you why. And, you know, I talk about being raped as a child in the book. I don't get emotional so much. I get emotional when we talk about my friend who protected me in that neighborhood. I wouldn't be sitting here at this table if I didn't defend myself and my friend. He had just been shot 4 times, and he died in my arms, and they were coming back. I was 17 years old. This is 40 years ago. They were coming back to finish the job. So I did pick up his weapon, and I did fire it to defend his life and my own life, and then he died in my arms. And so no, I don't regret. The book is a transparency look at what happens in the kind of neighborhood that I'm from, and so I can tell you, I've had hundreds and hundreds of people come up to me about that book, whether they were exposed to or experienced sexual assault or rape, or they overcame poverty or domestic violence, or any of the things I talk about in the book, and they have tears in their eyes. They tell me it changed their life. So whether I win this election or anything that happens in this election, I will never regret publishing that book.
Well, and I wonder, too, I mean, did writing it make you want to run for office? I mean, did sort of letting all this out allow you to feel like you wanted to do that?
I had zero belief or thoughts that I would run for office for writing the book. The book was really about, you know, unexamined trauma. And I'm not sure if you're aware that Senator Warren and the Senate leader made made a joke about my book, claiming that I claim to be a tough guy. Actually, that book explains that I'm not so tough, that you can't suppress unexamined trauma and say, well, it happened, so what, move on with it, pick yourself up. That can carry you, that attitude can carry you a long way. And I understand people that do that, but if you don't, that unexamined trauma will come back. And it came back with me. And so the book was a therapy session for me to deal with issues that I didn't deal with for 40 years. You know, my mother was stabbed when I was 6 years old in front of me. I never dealt with it. I didn't deal with the rapes that I went through for 2 years because I said, what can I do to change with it? And I focused on overcoming poverty, and I focused on being a good father, unlike my father. And but then when I accomplished all those goals, all of a sudden that unexamined trauma snuck up on me. And so that's why I say I could never regret that book. You know, whether it cost me the election or any of that, I don't know. It is the truth. I will tell you something that the voters will get with me. They'll get the guy in that book. They'll get someone who's transparent, someone who will be honest, someone who will never say something he doesn't believe in, and a person of his word. And so I think the voters are ready for someone like that.
John Deaton, candidate for U.S. Senate here in Massachusetts. Thanks so much, sir. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Of course.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, up next, one of the officials leading the state's Cannabis Control Commission.
Ava Concepcion joins us to talk about the state's marijuana industry and the possible impact of the drug being reclassified and what that could mean for business and research. Stay with us.
Welcome back to At Issue. Massachusetts recreational marijuana establishment has passed a few financial milestones recently.
Yeah, in April, cannabis businesses passed $6 billion in gross sales, and the establishment has brought in more than $1 billion in state and local tax revenue.
And cannabis businesses here could, with the emphasis on could, see some tax relief from the federal government thanks to the Biden administration's efforts to reclassify marijuana as a less dangerous drug. Joining us to talk about all of this is Ava Concepcion, the acting chair of Cannabis Control Commission. Thanks so much for joining us, Ava. We sure appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about this reclassification. It could take a few months for this actually to take effect, but what sort of impact do you see here in Massachusetts, specifically on the recreational side to start?
So there are a few things. I think people are really excited by the prospect of having those tax relief efforts coming through with the 280E changes. A lot of the things that we've heard here in the Commonwealth is that access to capital has been and remains really the top issue when it comes to equity and really the smaller businesses getting online. So having access to those traditional banking methods will have an impact here. The other thing is when we talk about research in cannabis, it's really limited right now because of the federal legalization not being a thing just yet, but it will potentially open those doors to have more research. And on the medical side, that will really have a positive impact for those patients and consumers that utilize this as their for medicinal purposes. I think that the Commonwealth is the state that has really been a leader in a lot of different ways. Specifically, when we talk about equity, we were the first state in the entire state in the Commonwealth. We were the first state in the entire nation to have equity baked into our mandate. So we have our social equity program, we have priority and expedited review processes, we have positive impact plans that are really necessary for all establishments to get on board and contribute to those communities that have been most impacted by the war on drugs. But we will have to see if that framework will need to be amended by any sort of federal efforts that change the way that we regulate here in the Commonwealth. But we've been the leader for a number of reasons, and the first online on the East Coast.
Talk about the expansion of those programs, the grant programs, working around equity, because some people complain, well, we started with the idea of equity, and now as things are launching, I'm not seeing the equity that was promised. What's the plan for that?
So that has been really a top priority. And it's something that we've talked about on many occasions at the commission level. It's something that me and my colleagues have advocated for and a number of different stakeholders have advocated for years. But what we've seen is equity has always been a part of the state level process. But before you can even get to the Cannabis Control Commission, you have to get past that local process, getting an HCA, getting that community approval, so on and so forth. So we've had the passage of Chapter 180 that took effect in August 2022. And that brought in a whole new comprehensive set of laws and in effect, a whole new comprehensive set of regulations that we promulgated that are geared towards increased equity. It created the Social Equity Trust Fund that you referenced. It gives the Cannabis Control Commission the ability to review host community agreements that have really been an interesting topic because of community impact fees and the way that those are designated. But it also requires municipal equity at that local level. So before you get to us now, all municipalities throughout the Commonwealth have to have equity measures in place now.
Well, and how much is left in that trust fund that you were referencing there?
So the trust fund is something that recently got online. And I want to clarify that it's, although we advocate for it, we also, the industry contributes to that trust fund. It is not under the authority and the responsibilities of the Cannabis Control Commission. It falls under the executive branch of the Commonwealth. But I know it's continuing to grow, and even recently there were $2.3 million in grants that were given across 50 different entities, so social equity entities that needed those funds in order to get past a certain hurdle for emergency use.
What are the challenges that you see around the regulations and businesses getting launched? You talked a little bit about it, but I talk to cannabis operators, I talk to folks who are in the field, and they want to, like, for example, back in December, the CCC voted to get rid of the 2-driver requirement, that 2 employees had to be in every car. What other complaints are you hearing from the business people, and what do you think you can do to address them?
So that was a major, I'm glad you brought that up, because the delivery license types, it's really unique. Those are the only license types currently online that are exclusively available to equity participants. And what we heard, and through the dialogues that we've had with licensees who are operating in that space, is that by requiring the 2 drivers, it really put a burden on their overall financial situation. So we talked to law enforcement as well, we talked to the Cannabis Advisory Board, and we were able to come to the conclusion that that was no longer a necessity. And that vote did occur in December. Last week, we actually brought the delivery driver conversation back to the forefront during our public meeting to talk about some other provisions that might make that license type more viable, including allowing delivery to no towns, potentially having delivery to hotels. It doesn't look like that will happen based on the conversation, but it's something we continue to look into. Another license type that is the smaller type and is for smaller businesses, local businesses, is the micro business license type. And that's something that we've also voted for to make some changes to make that a more viable license type. So these are things that are in the works, and we see that happening within the year, some regulatory changes.
So we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the Shannon O'Brien situation. She was the chair of the CCC. She was suspended last year by Treasurer Deb Goldberg. O'Brien was accused of making racially insensitive remarks and mistreating former CCC Executive Director Sean Collins. She denies the accusations and has sued. What sort of problems has this brought and controversy has this brought to the CCC?
I think it's a sort of two-pronged answer to that. And I say that because from the outward-facing attention in media, it's definitely drawn a lot of political fodder. I think that's the nicest way I'll say that. But internally, it hasn't had a detrimental impact. We've continued to be really focused on the work here. I think it's evident by what we've been able to accomplish. I've been acting chair since September, so it's going on quite a few months of just making sure we had those Chapter 180 regulations promulgated. So that has been a really key thing that we've been working on. Having those changes around delivery, voting on micro businesses, making sure that the industry continues to thrive. You referenced earlier that we've reached that $6 billion mark. During that time frame between September and now, we've also seen $1 million in increased revenue here. So I think essentially from our perspective at the Cannabis Control Commission, we still have to work. We don't have the luxury of stopping and sort of engaging. And it's also outside of our authority and our purview because ultimately is the appointing authority's determination.
Ava Concepcion, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Well, that's it for this edition of At Issue. Join us next Sunday when we look back on the 20th anniversary of same-sex couples being able to legally marry in Massachusetts.
Plus, State Senator Jamie Eldridge will join us to talk about his efforts to make the legislative process on Beacon Hill more transparent.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Pritchard.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. Enjoy your day.